When did you first notice it? Perhaps you can't remember. It's been so long ago, but at one time in your life, it came very clear to you that there was a gap, a chasm. I remember realizing that there was a gap between people. New people came into the neighborhood. The neighborhood was excited. They wanted to meet them. And then came the rumor, the gossip, that the father was a thief. And all of a sudden there was a gap. I also noticed it one day when a native and his 2 children came to visit us. My dad and his dad, their dad, were talking about some business. We didn't have many people to play with. And so we were quite anxious to play with these 2 native children. It didn't happen. They didn't want to. Around our dining room table, or rather kitchen table, we used to talk at least 2 or 3 times a week. It would be about how we were better than the neighbors. I found out that's not true when I got to know them. But there was that gap. And perhaps you have been talking to somebody and you were enjoying the conversation, but the topic of God or Jesus Christ came about. And you instigated it because it seemed like a really good opening. And all of a sudden the conversation stopped. There was a chasm there. And Jesus talks about such chasm or divorce between people. He talks about it in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. It's not usually a passage I like to preach on or talk about, and yet it's important because Jesus tells this parable. It talks about hell. In fact, did you know that Jesus talks about hell more than anybody else in the Bible? So what does he have to say? He wants us to consider this. And we'll do it in 4 different points. And the first one is that there are 2 men. They were absolutely opposite to each other. There's quite a contrast right from the beginning. There was one man who was very rich. The other man was impoverished. The one man lived in a house that almost a king would live in, with a wall around it. And the other man, called Lazarus, laid on the outside of it by the gate. And so you have 2 men. One that was rich, one which was just impoverished. You had one man in need and one who didn't have any needs. You had one man that was happy and one who wasn't. You had one man that would dress in fancy clothes, fit for a king, and another one lay in rags. You had one who could eat as much as he wanted and never be in need for having something in the stomach, and the other one who wanted just the crumbs. There was one who had no hope, and one that had life. It just called him and said, you have so much hope. And so you have one man that everything seemed to be against, and one that everything seemed to be for. And for Lazarus, the only hope he had physically was that someone would give him something to eat. And the only comfort he had came from dogs. Not the domestic dogs that we have today, but they were considered as just horrible things But they gave Lazarus comfort because they licked his wounds, and in doing so, there was some healing in it. He had been laid at the gate by some of his family that could no longer afford to look after him, hoping that the rich man would give him some crumbs. But the rich man hardly did. And so you had this rich man who had everything going for him. He had a reputation in the neighborhood that was good, whereas Lazarus did not. He was able to go to the synagogue and the temple, but Lazarus wasn't. And so people liked him. He probably poured a lot of money into that synagogue. He probably helped a lot of people, but not Lazarus. He helped the people that could help him back. And so when he prayed in that synagogue, his prayers weren't really heard, because his God was one of money and wealth and reputation and power and clothes and anything material. But that wasn't the way it was with Lazarus. Lazarus was a nobody. When you're down lying on your back, all you can do is look up. And he looked up. He had heard about the Messiah that was coming. He knew there was a God, and so he reached out and asked for mercy. And God answered his prayer. Sometimes we think that people outside the church don't ask for mercy from God. But there are people who do. The church may have said, wash your hands off, and yet God has not. And so there were two destinations. You know, there are many religions, many ways of looking at things. You can be rich, you can be a different race, different color, and yet there's only two destinations. We come to God, and then we're separated. Jesus said, the goats from the sheep. The sheep go to heaven, the goats go to hell. And so we have two funerals. And the first funeral wasn't really a funeral. It was Lazarus. Lazarus' name just simply means one whom God showed mercy. That's what the word means. He died with nobody around. And when he died, the dogs probably did some damage to his body. And then he would be thrown on the dump. That's what they did with the untouchables in Jesus' day. And it was almost like he was born, he died, and nobody even noticed. But that wasn't the way it was with the rich man. He died with his family around him. And then there was a big celebration, a big funeral. And people honored him. But after death, there's a great equalization. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't take it with you. It doesn't matter what reputation you have before others. The reputation you need to have is with God. And so the rich man must have been absolutely shocked. Him being a religious man, after all. He was a Jewish person. He was the descendant of Abraham. And he went to the synagogue. He gave money to the synagogue. And he ended up in hell. And where was Lazarus? Well, Lazarus was in heaven. It said beside Abraham, which simply means that he was being blessed with Abraham in the presence of God. The Does that sound fair? Well, actually, the rich man asked for mercy. But you will notice one thing, and that is that the rich man never said that God was not just. But instead he asked for mercy. He said, I'm being tormented here. My tongue is burning. Put a little water. Send Lazarus over to me with some water to put in my tongue. Did you notice something? That rich man was still arrogant. He expected Lazarus still to be a servant, to be a slave. He was so far above Lazarus that he wanted Lazarus to do whatever he wanted him to do. He hadn't changed. And he spoke to Father Abraham. He didn't speak to God because he didn't want to have anything to do with God. So he always referred it to Abraham. And he wanted mercy. And I can see why, but it was too late. It was too late to have mercy. He had been given all the days of his life to have mercy. He knew about that in the synagogue, in the church, and he did nothing about it. And it was too late. That's sad. Because Jesus says, come to me. All you who are burdened, I will give you rest. And then he had another request. It wasn't for himself, it was for his brothers. He had 5 of them. And when you look at the scriptures, what it says about hell, we don't really know what it's like, but fire and brimstone, that could be simple. And even if it's simple, even if it's real, it's far greater a punishment than what it says, because how can you describe it? The anger or wrath of God. And so he had a plea. If you can't help me, my brothers are still on this earth, do something for them. And then, how is he going to do that? Lazarus. Send Lazarus down from heaven to speak to my brothers. That seems like a reasonable thing. But God said no. There's a gap. There's a gap between you and Lazarus. There's a gap between heaven and the earth, reality that we live in. It can't be done. Remember how Lazarus got here? He trusted in me. And precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his saints. No, he's at rest. He's received his reward. He's with me, and nobody will take him from me. He's not going to go back. But this rich man really thought that if Lazarus did go back, then they would listen. But God said, they have the law and the prophets. Let them believe it. What's in the law and what's in the prophets? Well, first of all, we find that there's a God. He's created us. He sustains us. He's created us perfect. We fell in the Garden of Eden, and we need a Savior. And in the Old Testament time, God promised to send a Messiah, and they were to trust in the Messiah and what he was going to do. And anyway, it wouldn't work. There was another man called Lazarus. He was the brother of Martha and Mary. And he died. 4 days later, Jesus came. And when Jesus said, open the tomb, he said, no, can't do that. Jesus said, remember, I said, I'm the resurrection and the life. And he raised Lazarus from the dead. But did his enemies believe that? Did they flock to Christ? Not at all. When Jesus Christ died, and when he rose again, did they believe what he said? No. Paul the apostle, before he became an apostle, he was out to destroy every Christian. And it was only when he met the risen Christ that he changed his mind. His life was transformed, and he died for Christ. There's that gap. There's only one person that can bridge that gap, and that is Jesus. In John chapter 6, verse 24, Jesus says this, I tell you the truth. The one who believes in me will live and will not be brought into condemnation. He has passed over from death to life. It's through Christ that we pass from death to life. He's the one who bridges the chasm. Think about this. I will. Thank God that he's come into your life